Now, turning to our program, I am pleased to introduce Peter Coffey, good friend and partner at Michael Best, to introduce today's speaker. Peter?
I'm going to give you 3 stories from our personal life about Harry, and then you'll understand a little bit more after you've read the introduction. In 2016, on a Monday or Tuesday, I called Harry and said, my wife is thinking about whether or not to attend Kellogg. And Harry returned the call an hour later and said, well, I'm teaching this Friday and this weekend. If you folks would like to come down, we can talk about it, and I will then make sure she can take a class and see what she wants to do. 3 days. Next, my wife decides that she liked Harry as a teacher and she wanted to share his experiences with the students at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And Harry did a round-trip to La Crosse to speak to her class. My third one was a friend of mine a couple of years ago was the then dean at Marquette's business school, and he was looking to get out of it. He'd been there, he took it as a whatever. And I said, I've got somebody who's not going to know much about Marquette, but I said he did go to Lawrence, so he'll know Wisconsin, and you might want to run some things past him. Sure enough, that afternoon, they connected, and I got a text back saying that was one of the more insightful discussions I've had. So the interesting thing about Harry is that he's had, as you can tell, multiple careers and continues to have multiple careers. But what is most fascinating now is how he has decided that he can pay it forward through his work as a teacher, as an author, and as someone who challenges us to be our best self. And without further ado, you are lucky to hear him because a number of people around the world can hear him on Amazon Leadership right now that came out last week, but we get to hear him in person. So with that, Harry Kraemer.
Well, thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, it is, this is like a Kellogg class. It is my great pleasure, because I think it was about 10 years ago I had the opportunity to come up here, and being a student at Lawrence University, I've got a lot of friends in Milwaukee, and I pass through Milwaukee a lot. Some people say I know Milwaukee very well because when I was a senior at Lawrence, I met a young woman who was a freshman. In fact, it was her very first day of school. And I started to date her, and everybody was teasing me, but, you know, hey, you're rocking a cradle, and it's her first day of school. Well, I was only there for a term because I graduated. I came down to Chicago, and I tell my 5 children that you really shouldn't do this, but it was okay 45 years ago, is every other weekend I would hitchhike from Chicago up to Appleton, Wisconsin. I had to always get around that 894 bypass, so I know every little town. I know every truck stop. But after doing that for a while, her father called me and said, I know what's going on, and you need to come up to Minnesota and spend a weekend with me. So I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to do that. And I flew up there, and I thought this will okay. He goes, hey, I know this is getting serious, and I really do believe we need to spend a weekend together. So I flew up there thinking we'd go to a Viking game. He said, no, this isn't going to be a Viking game. You're going to go on a retreat with me. And I said, what's the retreat? He said, you'll find out. And you're going to think about values, purpose, how you're treating my daughter. And I thought, okay, well, I'm already there. So we drove out to this retreat center, and on the way out, he said to me, if I had known this, there's no way I would have flown up there. He said, it's a silent retreat. And I said, what does that mean? He said, you can't shut up for 3 minutes. You will not be talking for the next 3 days. That's when I asked myself the obvious question, how much do I like this guy's daughter? But being a finance guy, sunk cost, I'm already there. I might as well check this out. And I did it. And it was run by the Jesuits, and they basically asked a lot of the things that you folks talk about. You know, what are your values? What is your purpose? What matters? You know, what is truth? And you spend the weekend doing that, and at the end of it, they say this shouldn't be a one-time occurrence. You should spend 15 minutes a day doing a personal self-examination. So I thought I'd do that for a couple of weeks, and I think as I mentioned to Peter, I do this every night. I do a 15-minute personal self-examination based on the Jesuit principles, asking yourself, what did I say I was going to do today? What did I actually do? What am I proud of? What am I not proud of? How did I lead people? How did I follow people? If I lived today over again, what would I have done differently? And then the last one is if I have tomorrow, knowing full well sooner or later I won't, but if I do have tomorrow, based on what I learned today, how will I operate differently tomorrow? As a father, as a spouse, whatever your religious faith base is, what difference do you really want to make in the world? And so I mentioned this to the students, and usually the students will say, well, how long have you done this? And, well, I've done this for about 45 years. And they said, well, is that the whole story? No, it's not the whole story. The rest of the story is I didn't marry his daughter. And for the last 45 years, the first weekend in December, it's either the 5th or the 8th or 4th through the 6th, I fly to St. Paul, Minnesota, and I go on this 3-day silent retreat for the 44th consecutive year with my 92-year-old father-in-law. And it's interesting because all of us in whatever business we happen to be in, we all have a strategic plan for our business, and then we have our operational, how are we doing? And it occurred to me, why wouldn't you do the same thing for yourself, right? So maybe once a year, actually taking the time to figure out, well, what really does matter? What really is your purpose? The blink of an eye, you're on this earth. And what kind of example do you want to set? So for a guy who really likes to talk a lot, as Peter knows, it's the 3 most important days of the year for me. There's no scenario. In fact, it was kind of funny because on the way to having 5 children, Julie would say, hey, they do this 47 weekends a year. So, right now we're pregnant with our 3rd, could you go a different weekend? And I, very respectful, say, Julie, I'll do anything for you, but that's the week my group goes. I'm part of group 46. That's the group that I go with. But being a very bright Lawrence student and Kellogg student, she'll say, but you don't talk to any of these people. I don't. That's very true. I don't. But that's my group. That's my team. So when I was leaving, I always say I went to Baxter Healthcare for 2 years. I forgot to leave, and I ended up being there for 25 years. Never dreaming I'd end up being the chairman, the CEO of the company. But when I was leaving, the fellow who had been my finance professor at Kellogg said, hey, I'd really like you to teach. And I said, you don't mean like have a syllabus grade paper? That's not, I run companies. And he said, I think you said you do whatever I asked you to do. And he thought I'd do finance. And I said, you got all these PhDs. I got an MBA. He said, well, what do you want to do? And again, this is almost 20 years ago. And I said, boy, the world we're living in today, the only thing I'm sure of is that we need more value-based leaders. We need more people with values that can have an impact on business, sports, religious activities, the government, you name it. And he said, that's fine. You start in 2 weeks. You better get a syllabus together. And I thought I'd do this for a couple of years. I really thought I'd do this for a couple of years. But since I left the CEO job pretty young, I was only 50, I thought, maybe I'll do this a couple of years. And I can't even believe this is my 20th year of teaching at Kellogg. And now it's 70. The dean said to me a couple weeks ago, well, we love having you teach, and you've been the professor of the year, but I mean, at 70, what are your plans? And I said, well, I've talked to Julie a lot about this. I prayed a lot about this. And the conclusion is, and you should have plenty of notice, I'm probably down to my last 20 years. And she said, how could that be? And I said, I don't know what it's like in your marital situations, but Julie told me 45 years ago, for better or worse, sickness and in health, but not for lunch. You being home for lunch, you're too hyper. We can do it on the weekends, but you're going to have to keep yourself busy. So I get it. So this whole thing about values and leadership and making a difference has been something that Peter and I have talked about this. I actually think we need to get more people focused on this. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, there's all issues that we've got, right? As a global society, as a global world, we're all hopefully brothers and sisters globally, despite differences. And there seems to be this whole series of issues. When we can number them, right? There's issues related to global poverty, global health care, digital divide, the environment. There's a lot of issues. And I know Rotary's involved in trying to deal with some of these educational issues. But I always realize that there seems to be this group of people that we expect to be able to deal with these issues. It's a very famous group of people that always has the same names. We always expect this group of people that are usually called those guys. Now, I've written a lot about this group. This is a gender-neutral term, but it's men and women, somebody else other than us. And I think you folks are a great example in Rotary of we are those guys. If we're not the men or women who's going to do something about it, who is? Who is? And I love to train leaders, executives, in literally asking two questions that I think are very, very helpful. The first question is, at what point in your life, it could be relatively young, it may not be till somebody's 70 or 80 years old, but at what point in your life do you realize I'm one of those guys? I'm one of the men or women who's going to do something about it, as opposed to I'm literally waiting around for somebody else. At what point, if ever, do you look in the mirror and say, you know what, I think I'm called to be one of the people in my community, in my area, in my hometown, in my family, that's going to make a difference. So at what point do you decide I'm one of those guys? The other question, and I like this one because I always like to keep things simple so I don't confuse myself. The other one, I think it's a great question to ask, is are you watching the movie or are you in the movie? See, there's a million number of people that talk about all the issues, right? You know, I'm concerned about this, I'm concerned about everything. Okay, that's great. Are you doing anything about it? Okay, are you watching the movie? Are you in the movie, right? And the way I sort of tease the students, I love to go to the movies. It's sort of like a hobby of mine. And I sort of tease where I'll go to a movie, and I've got this big box of popcorn. You know, Julie told me not to have it, but I have it, okay? And on the screen, the bad guys are getting in the getaway car outside the bank. I take the box of popcorn, I put it on the seat next to me, I jump on the screen. Are you watching the movie or are you in the movie? Are you talking about the issues or are you doing something about it, right? And one of the articles I let executives and the students look at, and many of you have seen this. This book was written a long, long time ago, but I think there's one issue in it that really is relevant. You may remember Stephen Covey, the fellow who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the one slide in that I always remember very clearly, you may remember it, he has this one page where he draws this really big circle of concern. Really big circle of concern. Now, I'm concerned about a lot of things. And inside the circle, there's this very small circle within it, the circle of influence, right? And I think his whole point is, hey, here's a great idea. Why don't you shrink the circle of concern? Why don't you increase the circle of influence so that you're not going to end up worrying about a lot of things that you're not going to do anything about, right? And this whole idea of let's literally make something happen. And then in thinking a little bit about this, and I'll make some comments, but then again, I really would love to take as much time to answer any comments. I think, all right, well, what's the progression of this? And when I first started teaching, I realized, the very first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to first develop more leaders. And very, very often, it's interesting, people that may already be leaders. By the way, show of hands, how many of you at one point or another had people reporting to you? Just sort of curious. Okay. Well, and when you have people reporting to you, I mentioned this when I do a group with CEOs or so on, they'll say, well, I'm already having people report to me, so check the box. I got the leadership thing under control. And I said, well, no, leadership in my mind isn't a destination. I actually think leadership is a journey. Every day we're blessed to be on this earth. I think we can get better than the day before. So it's a journey. How can I get better each day of that journey? What am I pretty good at? Can I get better? What are the things I'm not that good at? If I'm not that good at it, that's okay. I'll try, but I'll surround myself with people that are better than I am at the things I'm not that good at. That's where this whole team concept kind of becomes important, right? And I realized, okay, well, before I can lead other people, I better be able to lead myself. And that's where I spend a lot of time with people trying to figure out, do you know how to lead yourself? And many of us in this room have worked for people that are our leader. They're in a leadership position, but they're certainly not leaders because they don't even know how to lead themselves, right? I mean, we've all worked for some pretty remarkable people. In fact, sometimes I look at some of the people I've worked for and I'll ask myself, what happened to these people? I mean, did they have the wrong parents? I mean, something went wrong with some of these people, but they're our boss. And so this whole idea of, well, what does it really take to be able to lead myself? And I realized to lead myself, I better be self-reflective enough to take the time to get to know what my values are, what my purpose is, what really matters. And I better have a group of people that I can talk to that'll make sure that I'm not fooling myself, right? Because we can all play games, right? Julie does this for me all the time when she'll say, Harry, left to your own devices, you could convince yourself of anything. Do you want to know what I think? Well, the answer to that better be yes, or I'm in a lot of hurt after 45 years, right? So finding those people and then holding yourself accountable and really taking the time to figure out what really matters and why does it matter. And often when I talk with leaders, they'll say, well, geez, Harry, there's so many aspects of leadership. Why do you always start off with self-reflection? Some people would call it prayer. Why do you start with that? And being an old math major from Lawrence, I put things into equation even when there's no numbers, right? And here's 3 equations that helped convince me. It goes like this. If I'm not self-reflective, is it possible for me to know myself? I don't think so. The second part is if I don't know myself, is it possible for me to lead myself? I don't think so. And if I can't lead myself, how could I possibly lead other people, right? So this whole thing really does start with I have to really get my own act together. So I focused a lot on that in my first classes and my first writing. And all the ideas I get are really from my students. And then the students would ask, okay, that's how you lead yourself. Well, how do you lead an organization? How do you develop people? How do you provide feedback? How do you really help every person reach their full potential? And if they're in the wrong place, how do you get them in the right place? And how do you make sure you're helping develop everybody to their full potential, right? Really, truly caring about people. Because I think sometimes we have so much work to do, we think we can just tell people what to do, and they'll do it because, we're the boss. And I always love the quote of our 26th President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, and one of my favorite lines, I believe it goes along the lines of, people truly do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. And if they really do believe you care about them, they will do anything for you. So this whole idea of, I got to be able to lead myself, and then I have to be able to build a team. And then the students, right before COVID, said, all right, I kind of get that, but how do I live a value-based life? How do I live a value-based life? And that was interesting because I think people sort of get very confused about this one. And the best example I can think of, and I always do these little surveys. I was in China for a couple of weeks, and then I just got back from India. It seems to be true all over the world. But show of hands, how many have heard this expression called work-life balance? A little show of hands here. All right, this I decided, in fact, I tell all my students and executives, I'm going to encourage you never to use this expression. And the reason is, I'm going to say it out loud again, slowly, but look at my hands. You can say it to yourself as I say it out loud. Work-life balance. It kind of looks like you're either working or you're living. And some of us are working. If that's not living, what is it? So I decided to change it around. Instead of talking about work-life balance, I talk about life balance. Because most people are trying to balance their lives, right? Now, work is one part of it, but when I was writing the 3rd book, I literally asked people, 300 people around the world, how do you define life balance? And some people talked about 3 really important areas for them. Some people talked about 10. There's an amazing normal distribution related to 6. And 6 seems to cover just about anything anybody would want to do, right? In no particular order, there's one overall area for your career, continuous education, meetings like this. There's a second bucket for some people for family, friends. There's a third bucket, I will call it faith, religious, spiritual for some people. There's a fourth bucket for health. That's where you put sleep occasionally, maybe a little exercise. There's a fifth bucket for fun. And then there's a sixth bucket, I call it social responsibility, being a best citizen, making a difference the way folks at Rotary try to do. Those are 6 buckets. Now, most people, I don't think, take the time to figure out where they're spending their time, right? And some people say, well, I don't have enough time. And I'm always reminding people, we all have the time. It's a question of how you really prioritize it or not. And I always love to do a little survey. We don't make print this as a class. I focus and I literally call it Your 168. And I'm always kind of curious. There's only about 1 out of 20 people usually who know why 168 is the world's most important number. There's at least 3 or 4 people in this room that may know. Volunteer. Why is 168 the world's most important number? Number of hours in a week. What's your name? Brett, you get an A? You got an A for that? You get an A. And it's funny, not many people do. I do many, many talks, and all the proceeds go to an organization in Africa called the 1 Acre Fund. And so I was doing a talk to a big company in Chicago, and they purchased 500 books, and I was doing a talk, and the CEO, before I said, well, what's 168? I said, you bought 500 books. And he goes, well, I didn't get too far. It says it on the cover of the book. And he goes, I've been kind of busy. These CEOs get very, very busy. And he said, give me a hint. Give me a hint. And I said, well, I called the guy Charlie. I said, Charlie, when you're working really hard, really, really hard, how hard are you working? He goes, I'm working 24/7. I said, I was a math major. Go slow, 24 times 7, carry the 2. you usually get 168, right? So everybody in this room has 168 hours, right? And when somebody says, hey, I should do something in the community, I should maybe help people in underprivileged areas, or I should do a soup kitchen, or I should do some tutoring. And people say, well, I don't have the time. I'm always reminding people, you have 168 hours, okay? You have the time. Is it really a priority? And when somebody says, Harry, can you give me a hint? I don't know if I've got the time. A rhetorical question. How much television do you watch? How much social media do you do? I guess the average American now spends 5.5 hours a day on social media. I don't know. That's like 40 hours a week. I'm not so sure that's real productive, all right? Now, it's a value judgment. What really matters? And that's why self-reflection becomes important. And then about a year or so ago, another student came up to me and said, hey, there's one other thing you should think about. And how does this extend beyond yourself, beyond your work, beyond your team? How does this extend to the difference you want to make overall? And then I started taking a look and understanding legacy. And to be honest, I was one of these people who thought of legacy. Oh, I know, legacy. That's when you start to get to be 80 years old and you say, hey, I should make a difference and maybe I should set up a trust account or something. And it was sort of like, it sounded like sort of a financial component to it. And the more I researched it, the more I thought about it and reading about it, writing about it, I realized, no, legacy really is a very personal thing for all of us in this room as to what difference do we want to make while we're here that can impact our children, our grandchildren, our neighbors, and the next generation, maybe hundreds of years from now. And in researching it, I found a couple of interesting things. One, a lot of this depends on how you get started, right? For some of us, we may be very fortunate. It may come from our parents. It may come from our grandparents. It may come from friends. And it'll literally help you determine what's important and what's not, right? Because if you're in this mad race and we're moving very, very quickly, it's very, very easy to confuse activity and productivity, right? Everybody in this room has got a lot to do. We have a lot to do. And if you're conscientious, the response can be, well, I'll just go faster and faster, right? I can multitask, right? And of course, we've all got these things, which, iPhones, Blackberries, we've got all these things. And the great lie I believe about these things is it'll make us more productive. Well, it'll make us more active. We're very active. How productive are we? Moving so fast, we don't even know how productive we are, right? So taking a little bit of time to think about that. And are there people in our lives that have influenced us in a very, very big way, right? Because if you think about it, you're 15, 16, think, oh, I need a car, I need this, I need that. Well, because other people have it. Well, are there enough people that have impacted you to maybe remind you, well, maybe some of that stuff isn't as important as you think it is. And maybe you ought to think about, while you're on this earth, what really ought to matter and what not. And I had the benefit, my grandfather lived with us when I was growing up, and I wish there was more intergenerational folks that live together or are close to one another, because I think some of these folks that have been in the movie, and they're 70, 80 years old, you can learn a lot from these people. And one of the things that I write about this as well, one of the things that, and I don't know if this was his own story or whether he stole this from somebody else, but I remember talking about material things. He would always say, Harry, have you ever seen a hearse with a U-Haul going to a cemetery? And I said, why? He said, well, Harry, it seems like 90% of people, they're accumulating all of this stuff, and they must either believe they can take all this stuff with them when they die, or they're going to live forever. Because, Harry, think about it. If you can't take this stuff with you and you can't live forever, what are you doing with all of this stuff? And he said, Harry, think about, everybody a little older, they get to be older, and they're trying to figure out downsize or giving it away. And he said, Harry, is it you think it's a case where when people are 40 or 50, they don't realize that 40 years later they will be 80? You think that's a surprise? Because, Harry, if it is, I'm surprised they're surprised. Right? And so who are the people that may have had some influence on you? And then you say, okay, well, now I want to do something about it. Now I want to make a difference. And one of the things that I write about is it seems as if there is this little bit of a concern of, boy, there's so many issues to deal with. There's so many things. I mean, what can I possibly do about it? And as you all know, it's anybody who gets this thing started and they set a good example for somebody else and somebody else and somebody else, then this thing can start to take off exponentially. And one of the examples I used was I was talking to a young fellow, young teenager, and he literally was going into a grocery store up in northern Wisconsin, and there was a big bin of donating coats for folks who didn't have a warm coat. And he's saying, geez, the thing is empty. What can I do? I've only got one coat. but he put one of his coats in it and wrote a little sign saying, hey, if I'm putting a coat in, hey, would you think about it? And just wondering what would happen. And a week later he came in and the thing was overflowing with coats. There was hundreds and hundreds of coats there because he had put his name and his thing there. So this whole idea of what are we waiting for? And the earlier we get started in this, the better. Because some of you know, when people are younger, there's this view of, well, geez, I really should make a difference, but you know what? I don't really have the time now. I'll wait until later. And as I'm always encouraging younger people, as everybody in this room knows, there isn't going to be more time later. This only gets a little bit more complicated, right? It gets, children, elderly parents, you name it. There just is a lot that's going on. And I think the more you realize how much is going on, I've got 168 hours. I'm literally going to dedicate a certain amount of this time right up front so that I can make a difference. And then what I ended up doing was I thought, well, why don't I end up interviewing as many people as I can and find out, are there people that really have even taken tragedy and done something about it? And one of the examples that one of my students mentioned to me, she said, boy, there's a woman you really need to talk to. And I called her, and she was down in Atlanta. And it was a story that was really amazing to me. She had a son, and in his 20s, he had a very serious automobile accident, and he ended up on painkillers. And I guess it was such a serious issue that he ended up having an overdose, and he died. And when I talked to her, she said, my first impression was, how did this happen? How did God do this to me? I'm just going to retreat, and I'm just not going to talk to anybody or whatever. And then she woke up one day and said, Harry, I'll just use the words you use about I'm one of those guys. She said, why did this happen? And what could I do to minimize the chance of this happening to other mothers that lose their sons through these overdoses? And she ended up doing a lot of studies, a lot of work. I write about it. But the bottom line was, it appears that in medical school, there's so much for doctors to learn. And this is beginning to change now, but there's so much to learn. They don't really have the time, a lot of time, to focus on this whole issue of pain, right? So, hey, if you're under a lot of pain, well, geez, maybe here's some things to take. And she actually has developed a system now that she's employing in hospitals in Georgia to say, wait a minute, before we start taking a lot of extra pain medication, maybe we ought to think about more physical therapy. Maybe we ought to think about meditation. Maybe we ought to think about the fact, if you're having a serious operation, there will be some pain, okay? And to have it severely impact our bodies, maybe we ought to be a little careful. The woman is actually changing the world. And the other example that was probably the one that I'm most focused on personally is something that's called the 1 Acre Fund. And I know Peter's aware of this, but it's sort of amazing. But it's a really good example because in my first class, I always talk about, in my very first class, every quarter, who's going to deal with all these issues in the world, right? And we end up talking about this famous group of people called those guys. And one of the students ended up taking a trip to Kenya, and he came back and he said, I'm turning down a big job in New York. I'm actually one of those guys. And I said, what does that mean? He goes, well, I'm actually moving to Africa because there's 900 million people in the world that aren't eating, and they're farmers. And we said, I can't quite get my head around the fact, there's people in our city, but how does a farmer start? It doesn't even make a lot of sense. And he said, the problem is that when Kenya got its independence from the British in 1963, if you were a Kenyan citizen, you got a 1 acre plot. The problem is you couldn't raise enough produce on 1 acre to keep the kids alive. And so he said, Harry, if we could get hybrid seeds, basic fertilizer, really demonstrate some simple irrigation. He said, Harry, I think right now they're farming the way we did in New Hampshire or Vermont in like the 17th century. I think there's some things we could do. Well, here's an example of a guy changing the world. I talk to him very often. He's been over there now for, 17 years. He's hired 9,000 Africans. They have doubled or tripled the crop yield on 5.2 million farms. They started in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania. They're starting in Ethiopia. And when I talk to them and to say, boy, this is amazing, he said, well, Harry, we've just sort of started. This is nice. We got started, but there's over 50 million farms in Africa, so we're not even 10% of the way through it. And it's the 1 Acre Fund. And so I told them when the first book came out, and it's called From Values to Action, I said, the name of the book's From Values to Action. You're the best living example of From Values to Action. I'll let people talk about it. You're living it outside of Nairobi. So I said, what I'm not teaching, and I'm not running around on boards, I said, once a month, I will do leadership talks for companies, associations, gatherings. I said, and all of the speaker fees and all the books will all go to the 1 Acre Fund. So I told him I'd do one a month. Well, as Peter indicated, I love to talk. I'm pretty much everywhere. I was in China for a couple of weeks. I was in India. I'm someplace. So instead of one a week, I end up doing at least 2 a week. Well, 2 a week is 100 a year. And so I think my talk for you folks today is my 1,653rd talk. Okay? I love to talk. Okay? No, I love to talk. Well, I do all the talking except those 3 days, first week of December. So this whole idea of getting started, making a difference, being self-reflective enough to figure out you can't handle everything, right? So are there certain areas that are more logical for you, right? Is it poverty? Is it education? Is it literally the fact that, boy, oh boy, some of these issues, I literally think either through my knowledge, through the organizations I'm involved in, the network I have, but I'm just going to get started to make a difference. So that's a little bit of the background. That's a little bit what's going on. As Peter knows, I could launch if we wanted to. I could go till about 5 o'clock tonight. I mean, tonight. I'm doing a 4-hour class tonight from 6 to 10, but we could do one now. But however, since you guys have a time sheet that's amazing, you guys are pretty time oriented, and there's only 168 hours. But I do want to take some questions. I will stop here and take any questions. I should have mentioned this up front, but I tell every group I speak with, I was doing this in New Delhi, I had explained to them, we can take any issue that comes up. We can talk about it. By the way, the reason I say we can talk about anything, here's a little bit of another view. I have very few answers, but like everybody in this room, I have many opinions. So some speakers, they'll do Q&A, question and answer. I don't do Q&A. I do Q&A, question and opinion. And I'm happy to change opinions on anything. And sometimes, people will say, well, but that's a sensitive topic. There's certain things we really shouldn't talk about. Well, I actually believe leaders should be able to talk about anything. We'll be very respectful, okay? You may have an opinion very different than mine, but I respect you, I love you, and I want to understand why you believe what you believe. Because one of the biggest problems we have right now, I believe, with polarization, we've gotten to this strange perspective where people do not take the time to understand, right? I'm a big fan of St. Francis. I say it 5 times a day. I seek to understand before I'm understood. And think of the number of times when you're having a discussion with somebody and they say, well, I don't understand. I don't know if you've thought about this. When people say, I don't understand, usually they don't want to understand. They're just letting you know they disagree. I'm on a lot of boards. I was on a board a couple days ago, and a guy named Tony said, well, Harry, I don't understand where you're coming from. I said, Tony, would you like to understand? Because if you'd like to understand, I'm happy to explain my perspective. And if you want to disagree, that's fine. This is America, okay? But let's at least be respectful of one another. So, questions?
Well, people...
Thank you. Thank you.
And I can see people are beginning to gather up here, which is terrific. This is where we will take questions. But before we do so, I wanted to say that Harry's newest book is for sale over in that corner over there. And he takes cash. How much is the book, Harry?
$25.
$25 and checks. And I know a lot of us don't carry cash or checks these days, so I think we could have a honor system if they give.
You know what they could do? They could just they can take a book and then when they get home they can just make a donation to the 1 Acre Fund.
Okay, or they could send a check and we could send it on to
whatever
fund, whatever. We can make that happen. Okay, so and
by the way, people look at it too. It's a phenomenal story. If you just look up 1 Acre Fund.
1 Acre Fund, okay.
1acrefund.org. You can see the stories. You can see the videos. Andrew Yoon is the fellow star.
Well, we can make sure that we send that out to everybody who attended today. We can get it out to the Kellogg people as well as to the Rotary people. So that's an easy thing to do. And I think you started to talk about this, but one of the things that we really take a lot of pride in here at Rotary is being a place where people of different points of view can come together. And I think that what you're saying right now about seeking to understand is probably key to that. I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to add about civility today, because I think
I have a lot to say about this. And so this is a topic I'm probably more focused on now than anything. So let's think about this a minute, okay?
I would love to hear your
Okay,
thoughts
so
on it.
all right, so here's the thought. First, I think we have to ask ourselves, what happened? What happened? I think what happened was upward of 10 years ago, you have a view and I have a view, okay? I still like you, I respect you, but I understand why you believe what you believe. Now, what's happened with social media, and like everything else, there's good and there's bad. But one of the bad things that I don't know if people realize what occurred is with social media, these folks are so unbelievably bright with AI and everything else. They literally work it this way. If somebody's on the right, and by the way, you can be anywhere you want. It's America, right? But if somebody's on the right with social media, and they have this thing called echo chambers, you're on the right, virtually everything you hear will be exactly consistent with what you want to hear. And now you're on the left, and everything you hear will be exactly consistent with what you want to hear. Okay? They've done an amazing job about this. The problem is now when I sit down with you, I can't even imagine how you could believe that because I think I've got 100% of the information. No, I've only got part of the information. Okay? And again, if it's, the students will always say, well, can you give me an example? How did this happen? Well, notice I always say opinion. So you folks can challenge me because some folks are close to my age. They'll appreciate this, but this is my opinion as to what may have caused this, but I'm not sure. Here's a little story for you. When I was a kid, there were 3 stations. I know some people can't believe this. There were 3 stations. The news was a half an hour a day, and I think my parents always watched Walter Cronkite. It could have been Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, right? Or I think it was this young kid, Dan Rather, in Vietnam, okay? But there are these 3 people, right? It's a half an hour. Now, Walter Cronkite, for the younger folks to realize, it's a half an hour, but there's 10 minutes of commercials. That means he had 20 minutes. 20 minutes, that's what he had, right? And so I always tease people, the reason he ended every episode by saying, and that's the way it is, because that's the way it was. And he had 20 minutes, right? But then 3 things happened that I sort of tease my media friends about, right? The first thing that happened is somebody said, Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brink, they're very bright, but they're not that entertaining. Let's get some cute people and some nice outfits. Let's liven this thing up. Let's make it more entertaining. Step 1. Step 2, somebody said, hey, this is entertaining. By the way, why don't we make it 24 hours? And somebody probably said, what if there's no news? Not a problem. Not a problem. Not a problem. Because we're going to go from news to opinion, right? And then the third, the most diabolical, it's he really loves the right. We're going to give him his own station. You're on the left, your own station. And now you give people exactly what they want to hear, right? And I don't know if you realize how diabolical this is, but let's go back to Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite in 20 minutes, he may show a scene, now think about it, he may have shown a scene of Lyndon Johnson saying something or Jerry Ford, and they would say something like clip for like 30 seconds, and then they move on to something else because he only had 20 minutes. And we all speak English, so we heard what he said. Think about what happens now. It doesn't matter who's talking. Let's assume it's Biden. Doesn't matter. Biden says something, and immediately you'll notice after he says something, we say, and now we turn to our panel of experts. Who are these people? I mean, literally, who are they? But there's 5 of these talking people. I heard what Biden said, and if it's really clever, if you really switch, it's very clever. If Biden says something and you've got Fox on, they're basically going to say, "Oh, the guy's a total halfwit. What's he talking about?" But if you switch really quick to CNN, they're going to say, "That was about as thoughtful as Abraham Lincoln." That brings tears to my eyes, right? Because people just hear what they want to hear. And the answer to this, I believe, that we're all called for, I think everybody in this room, we should probably stop saying, I don't understand. I think we should take the time to understand, and then we can decide, do we agree or disagree, all right? But I think saying I don't understand, I think may be a little ignorant. So what do you have to do? I tell folks, you want to watch a little Fox, you better watch a little CNN. You read the New York Times, kind of liberal, maybe you ought to read the Wall Street Journal. I highly recommend you see a summary of the Financial Times or The Economist. Now you see this whole potpourri. Now you understand why everybody believes what they believe. What do you believe? And why do you believe it? But until that happens, until people get out of their individual silo, we're going to be walking around saying, I just don't understand. And the students will say to me, well, some things you can't understand. Oh, I think you can understand anything if you take the time. You just may not agree.
Thank you. Okay. Jeff.
Well, so many questions to ask. You talk about mattering a lot. And
What's
so what
that?
advice would you give to our organization called Bridge and Build Wisconsin with a mission to secure youth's mental health by resecuring Wisconsin's civic health through Lambeau Field. And the core building block, Lego brick, is mattering. How do we apply mattering to kids, to adults, and to civil society to get a better outcome?
I'm sorry, how do we what? I missed the one word.
Apply mattering.
But
Mattering, M-A-T-T-E-R-I-N-G, in thoughts, words, and deeds.
yeah. Well, for my own personal opinion is it starts with parents. It starts with the people they interact with. It starts with how do you make sure that the influences on children are a little bit better than having a social media on their little device in their bedroom and you don't even know what they're watching or who they're talking to. I mean, remember, when you and I were children, we didn't have a television in our bedroom, all right? We wouldn't let that happen. It's kind of fascinating. They got a television that we have no control over what they're watching. And unless the parents are involved, unless they're, in my mind, I think that together with an absence of being able to get some agreement on what truth is now, because it's all an opinion, because we don't even seem to be focused on facts, has a dramatic impact on us, our children, and I think the next generation.
Hello, thank you for coming to speak to us again. I remember when you visited us 10 years ago and appreciated your lessons then. So my question to you is with 168 hours,
Yeah.
Not all cultures view life balance in the same way. And I've heard you talk about traveling around the world.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your perceptions in terms of different regions as to how they view that 168 hours and how it should be used? Because I think we tend to have a very American view, and I'd like to hear some of the other ones that you experience.
Yeah. So, great question. What's your name? Yeah. Ryan. So, Ryan, interestingly enough, because I'm out of the country usually at least a week a month, and I mean everywhere. And at Baxter, 70% of our sales is outside the United States. So I'd be in different countries. We were in 103 countries. I actually think most people in most countries, we're not as different as you would imagine. Okay? Many people are concerned about their family. They are concerned about their health. Many are focused on their faith. It depends on what part of the world that you're in. And I do think the majority of people, and maybe I'm optimistic, want to sort of do the right thing. So I think that the similarities are much more than you would imagine. There are differences, okay? I mean, for some people, their work is enough that they're willing to sacrifice their health or something. But again, that depends a little bit on the country and how they've grown up. But I found in my trips, when I talk about this year 168 and life balance, it seems to ring true for most people, more than I ever would have imagined. Yeah.
Thank you again for the presentation. My name is Chuck Radel. I'm just curious, with the background you've had, with what you've been able to do and teaching now, you said you have 5 kids.
Yeah.
What paths did they take?
Sure. Well, first of all, we're very blessed. I mean, we've been very focused on making sure we spend a lot of time with the children growing up. Faith has been very important. Our 2 oldest went to Lawrence University, and my third daughter ended up going to Notre Dame. She got into that Notre Dame thing, which again I knew nothing about, but she had a great time. My youngest daughter ended up at St. Olaf in Minnesota. And my youngest fellow also went to Notre Dame and just graduated. So my oldest daughter worked for Epic System up in Madison. Came to Kellogg and now is in Boston, but moved back to Chicago. My oldest son is a data scientist for Databricks, an AI company in Austin, Texas. Shannon the Cannon, I mean, she's in marketing, but she's everywhere. Australia, you name it, everywhere. Now London. My youngest daughter, who went to St. Olaf, is a critical care nurse at the Mayo Clinic. And my youngest son, by coincidence, just started. He's at Epic System and just started about 3 or 4 months ago. And Julie and I are in Chicago. Julie went to Lawrence with me, and she also went to Kellogg with me. And she worked for Citibank. And then when our third child was born, she said, very faithful person. I'd really love to focus on our faith. So she's involved in 6 Christian boards, 2 of them which she's the chairman of in Chicago. Yeah.
Hi, go Irish.
Yeah. Are you one of these Notre Dame people?
St. Mary's of Notre Dame, but yes.
What's that?
Notre Dame, St. Mary's family.
Oh, okay, there you go. There you go.
So many individuals are taught the value of independence and self-reliance and focus internally on making sure that happens in life. And so what are some strategies to help them, or maybe not help them, but what are some strategies to capture their attention to make them focus more externally?
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. Now, depending on how you grow up, the earlier you realize it really isn't about me, right? It really is about the impact I can have on as many people as I possibly can. And you raise a great point, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately. You know, if you think about it, when you're in school, let's say we're all in school and you're the teacher, right? Well, we all want to sort of be the best because we want to impress you, and we'll be nice to one another, but it's kind of all about us, right? Well, then when you first start working in your first job and you're an intern at Baxter and everybody's an intern, you know, I want you, if you're the manager, to think, but as soon as you become a leader, the first time, it's no longer about you. It's how can you have an impact on as many people that are working for you. And if you happen to have good values, if you happen to believe in strong things, your ability to have an enormous influence on people is huge. You know, people said, oh, well, you know, what was it like, you know, being the CEO of Baxter, power, whatever. To me, it had nothing to do. First of all, I never thought I'd be in the job. But I think part of the reason what I was that every job I was ever in, I tell the students this, every job I was ever in, I tried to create an environment that everybody wanted to work for me. And I know this sounds overly simplistic, but if you take the time to find out who really good people are, and you create an environment that they want to work for you, you're going to do remarkably well because it isn't about you. And the problem I think a lot of leaders have, and let's be honest, we all know people that are senior leaders, they have enough people telling them how good they are and how great they are. Well, if you're not careful, you could start to believe it, right? And then welcome, it's a serious problem. And here's a simple equation for you on this one. I always tell people that, my another opinion, leadership has nothing to do with titles and organizational charts. I think leadership has everything to do with the ability to influence people. And the only way you can influence people, you have to be able to relate to people, right? And when I say relate, I need to know you well enough to know what motivates you, what excites you, how can I help you? And if I can relate to you, I can influence, I can lead you, right? So your ability, no matter where you are in the organization, I don't really care if somebody's 3 levels above you. If I can demonstrate I have no agenda here other than to be helpful, I can influence and lead an awful lot of people. And I think getting people to spend less time focusing on themselves, but encouraging them, wow, what a difference you can make. I mean, the thing I enjoyed about Baxter was I had 55,000 people in 103 countries that through my behavior, I could influence a lot of people. And that's the whole reason I love to teach, right? I just believe we've got such a shortage of leaders now. If I can reach 500-600 Kellogg alums, Kellogg students every year that hopefully at someday will be running things, I can have a very small impact, you know, on the future. And I think we all need to do that rather than waiting for somebody else to do it. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that. It actually leads into part of my question. You talked about values-based leadership, and I believe that younger people are very much interested in their values and ensuring that they are seen and heard in the workplace. So I'm curious, when you think about the current workplace where there's 5 generations of people working, what is your thoughts on the older generation who is really stuck in the ways that they've always worked, where there's like overworking and big me, little you, and you know, we suffered through this, and so you should have to as well.
Yeah.
So when you think about teaching now values-based leadership, I think that's amazing for the people who are entering the workforce and collegiate people. But when you're trying to change the world of work as it is now and integrate the 5 generations, what thoughts might you have on that?
Yeah. So you're right. It kind of comes back to the last discussion. Leadership, influence, relate. I think what's really important as a leader is you got to be able to relate to each person individually, right? And so understanding what motivates people, what do they care about, how do you create enough flexibility for people? And here's another good example where I'm a big fan of balance. Everything is in balance. I do hear and I do understand that there are different generations, X, Gen X, Gen Y, Z, and so on. And I think there's some sensitivities. However, I worry that sometimes academics will put people into these different buckets. And the sensitivity I have is I'm not so sure it's good to put people in buckets. And the reason I say that is I have 5 children. Supposedly they're Gen Z. They are unbelievably different. Right? My one daughter, I mean, she's driven like crazy. She went to Kellogg. And Shannon the Cannon, I mean, she's floating around all over the place. Okay? And then you say, well, the older people, right? Well, I look at my 5 brothers and sisters. We're all baby boomers. I mean, some of us are intense. Some of us are just wild and crazy. Some love to work. Some have never worked. I mean, you got every combination. So the only way I can think about it is how do you uniquely relate to people, understand what motivates them, and try to create enough flexibility that it works for people. At the same time, we've got to get the work done. I worry sometimes it's as if, I'll sometimes tease people and say, well, hey, Harry, I really only want to work 2 days a week, and I probably need about 3 months vacation and so on. Well, that's interesting, but that's not going to work, okay? Because we have stuff we got to do. So how do you create a balance? It's all about balance in my mind.
I think we have time for one last question here before we have to.
So that means we're not going until 5 o'clock. Is that what that means? Yeah.
Although, are you willing to stay for a couple?
I'll stay, sure. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks, Mary. Hi, Harry, Karen Hung. I'm a Baxter alum. Here's my question to you. Given the recent context of social, cultural, and market dynamics, like speed of change and level of ambiguity, how has the context impacted values-based leadership?
I would say, great question. I would say the speed of change and the speed of everything that's going on creates a higher degree and importance of communication. And here's a little equation for you, okay? I actually think change can be positive, right? If you think about Baxter or whatever, if you're the one creating the change, maybe you're creating a competitive environment for yourself. Change is good, okay, if it's done correctly. But here's the problem. I think to a certain degree, there's change, and it doesn't get communicated very well. And if it doesn't get communicated very well, we have this whole area of uncertainty, right? And here's the equation. Change plus uncertainty equals chaos. And we've got an amazing amount of chaos going on because there's a lot of change, but nobody's explained why we're making the change or what the benefit of the change is. And everybody's confused, everybody's mixed up. And so the importance of communication. Why are we doing what we're doing? How does that impact me? Anybody that's been in a company that's been involved in an acquisition, it's a great example, right? I have a company, I acquire your company, right? And they'll often say, oh, by the way, we're acquiring your company. You know what? In the next 6 months, we'll let you know what the impact of it is. And then we're surprised when 6 months later, all the good people have left, right? Because when the announcement comes out, people are going to want to know, how does that affect me? How does it affect my family? How does it affect my job? Who's my new boss? Do I have to move? So why wouldn't I say, hey, you know what? We're going to buy your company. But by the way, let's talk through before the announcement. What are the impacts? How do we minimize the uncertainty? And then we can create the change. But with the amount of change that's going on now, tariffs are this one day, it's change another day, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're reducing the size of the government, we're not sure who's going to do what or where. The level of uncertainty and lack of communication creates chaos. And the only way I know how to do that, I'm a fanatic about communication. And the way I try to operate every team I'm on is if you're on my team, I'd say, the only reason I know something that you don't is that you didn't ask and I didn't think of telling you because I thought you already knew. That's the level of communication and openness we need to have. So great being with everybody. And the last comment I make to everybody is no pressure. You are those guys. So good luck.